This is the story of how Lloyds TSB Bank, Britain's only AAA rated bank in 2008, built up over 250 years, was destroyed in 150 days by virtue of the merger of that bank with HBOS. HBOS was bust. In 2008, HBOS was in danger of having to close for business. In absolute secret, the state loaned HBOS £25 billion in October 2008 by way of so-called ELA, Emergency Liquidity Assistance, a loan of last resort. The American Federal Reserve, under their discount window, loaned HBOS a further $11 billion in October 2008. We have asked Lloyds TSB to tell us whether they also loaned $10 billion to HBOS at that time, and they haven't yet answered us. We assume that they did. Now bear in mind that the Bank of England is the banker's bank, or the bank's bank. It is the bank to which banks go for their banking needs. They make measures available from time to time as are required by banks. In 2007-2008, the world was in financial crisis, and the government announced a special liquidity scheme to assist banks with their liquidity problems. This was publicly announced. As is an absolute legal prerequisite requirement, it was approved by the European Commissioners. It was available to all banks. It was taken up by most banks. Completely different is ELA, an emergency loan which is given to banks as a loan of last resort. When ELA is made available, it is a signal that that bank is in jeopardy of closing down because it is utterly bust. Before September 2008, Sir Victor Blank and Eric Daniels, who had replaced the likes of Brian Pittman as the persons at the helm of Lloyds TSB Bank, wanted to become Britain's biggest bankers, and they wanted to acquire HBOS, but competition law stood in the way. So Victor went to Israel in a drinks party, and Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, agreed to sidestep competition law. In the middle of September, Lehman's Bank in America went bust. The Fed refused to bail it out, and it imploded and closed down. It went insolvent. The financial crisis deepened and hit the UK. Her Majesty's Treasury called in the bankers. Some went off to solve their own problems, but RBS and HBOS stayed behind with Lloyds TSB. Lloyds TSB was in no danger, had no problems, but it stayed behind because of Blank and Daniel's desire to become Britain's biggest bankers. They announced that they were going to merge, and he who is not given to superlatives announced that a wonderful deal had been done. Unusually, the FSA, a regulator, said that HBOS was well managed and capitalized. Gordon Brown publicly supported the deal, as did Alistair Darling. What we do not know, and as we've pointed out before, was that in the beginning of October, ELA was made available to HBOS. The American Federal Reserve loaned money to HBOS, and Lloyds itself probably loaned money to HBOS, all in complete secrecy. In the beginning of October, Peter Mandelson was brought into government and became the business secretary. He passed an order in council to deal with competition laws. The terms of the deal were revised. It was touted as good news. And on the 13th of October 2008, the European Union approved the special liquidity scheme. Note, not the ELA. There was no mention of the ELA or the FDW. The top four accountants firms were concerned that the banks were not going concerns, and met with the Chancellor and then Lord Miners, and received a confirmation that if the banks got into trouble, they would be bailed out by the state, and therefore they overcame their problems of having to file going concern reports. It is worth noting that in the case of Lloyds, the audited accounts of 2007 and the monthly accounts up to July or June 2008 were used, which was before the ELA FTW or loan of £10 billion was made. A circular and a prospectus were published in November 2008. As I said, old accounts were used. There was no mention of the ELA, the FTW, or the £10 billion. Shareholders were asked to vote, and they did, and they voted in favour. There were proceedings in Scotland to prevent the sale of the Bank of Scotland. These proceedings came before the Competitions Appeal Tribunal. A secret dossier was filed in which no mention was made of ELA or FTW, and the case based on competition law was lost. Costs were awarded. After that, the FTW was repaid in secret. In January 2009, the scheme of arrangement setting out the terms of the merger was heard before the Scottish Court of Session and approved, although there was objection. There was no mention of ELA or FTW. This approval was granted on the 15th of January. The very next day, 16 January, the ELA was repaid in secret. On 19 January, the merger was completed. The next month, February 2009, black holes were revealed. It was announced that RBS had taken up the asset protection scheme. In May 2009, there was a first rights issue. Lloyds TSB shareholders invested more in Lloyds Banking Group. On the 23rd of November 2009, there was a second rights issue. Further investment in Lloyds Banking Group. That is 23 November. 24 November, the Bank of England announced that it had 14 months prior made a loan of ELA to HBOS. There was no mention of the FTW, and the Governor of the Bank of England said now that RBS has taken up the asset protection scheme and Lloyds have taken measures to recapitalise, he was announcing the ELA. In actual fact, the Bank of England had announced that RBS had taken up the asset protection scheme in February. Only in April 2011 was the news about the FTW revealed on an application to court by Bloomberg and Fox. In May 2011, further losses have been revealed of 3.5 billion. The share price has slid. We don't know what is next, but we shudder to think what is coming. Bear in mind that ELA is completely different to SLS. When Northern Rock was granted ELA, there was a run on the bank and almost £5 billion was withdrawn overnight. We have evidence, expert evidence, that if they had announced the ELA to HBOS and RBS, then there would have been a run on the banks. There would have been no merger. The only option available to the government was to nationalise HBOS as they did with RBS. But they chose instead to use the shareholders of Lloyds TSB to save the day. The granting of the ELA was illegal because it had not been approved by Europe. We say that by virtue of the non-disclosure of the loans, shareholders were misled into undertaking this merger, and that if the truth had been told, there would have been no merger, because the government would have had, as they did in the case of RBS, to nationalise HBOS. If they had chosen not to nationalise HBOS but still comply with the law, HBOS would have been declared bankrupt. Either way, there would not have been a merger. Either way, Lloyds TSB shareholders would not have suffered the losses that they did.